Hi, I'm Casey, manager of the customer success team here at Vanta, and we've heard you have some questions around policy. So we're doing a bit of a deep dive with our in-house expert, Matt Cooper. In this session, we'll go through SOC 2 and ISO policy stack, focusing today specifically on information security policy, or the AUP, acceptable use policy. And so with that, let me flip it over to Matt and we'll get started with a high level. What is this policy, Matt?
Hey, Caitlin. All right, the information security policy. So stepping back briefly into the SOC 2 and ISO requirements, why do we need policies? I'm going to read you an ISO policy, an ISO control, A.5.1, policies for information security. This is the 2022 version. An information security policy and topic-specific policies should be defined, approved by management, published, communicated to, and acknowledged by relevant personnel and relevant interested parties, and reviewed at planned intervals and if significant changes occur. So you should have policies for information security. It's an ISO control. There's some similar language in SOC 2. So starting off here, the information security policy. This is designed to be your primary employee-facing security policy. So we tried to put like all of the real meaty like end user stuff in here, whereas you'll find some of the other information security policies like your cryptography policy, right? That's more going to be for engineers or people kind of on the back end. Like users don't care. They just use the thing. And however, the cryptography just magically works. However, this one is for them. And then if we just scroll briefly to the end of it, Caitlin, you'll see we incorporate by reference, actually almost the end of it. How about one page back? We incorporate by reference all of the other policies in the stack just as part of painting a complete picture when they review and acknowledge them. And we basically say, hey, you're responsible for all of these things. Typically, customers will push the full stack to employees, but just understand this is where we're putting most of the main content that we want them to care about into this. So I think we'll walk through this now, Caitlin, sort of top to bottom. Okay, and then one more thing you saw in the title, it was the information security policy, parenthetical AUP. So the AUP is the acceptable use policy. And that's where it, unlike a code of conduct, which is kind of high level principles based, acceptable use is where you can get kind of granular, like, hey, like don't do this specific stuff, or you can do this stuff. And then similar with all the policies, that is very much for you to define as an organization. We are providing you with a template. If we have something in the AUP you don't like, take it out, or vice versa. If we didn't put something in that you care about, add it in, okay? All right. So first we have an overview. We have a purpose statement for the policy. This is the format we always follow. Again, if you want to tweak the language here, you're welcome to do that. And then we have the scope. Let's talk briefly about the scope. Who does the scope apply to, right? First off, make sure the language matches what you want in your environment. But there's a couple different common buckets. One is the employees, right? So the employees of your company are probably going to be in scope for your policy. The other thing is going to be contractors. So contractors, if they're doing a similar thing as an employee, like they're a contract developer or a contract IT person, oftentimes many companies will have them acknowledge that same set of policies. And they'll either put them through an onboarding flow, or they'll put them in, reference them in contract. There's different ways to do it, but the idea is contractors have to acknowledge and accept the same set of policies. The gray area then becomes like, well, what about like consultants, or something like that? You can scope people out. If a consultant is coming in and they're really not going to have any access to the systems, and you don't want to, make them jump through a bunch of hoops for no reason, like that's fine. So you can scope it the way that you want to, and then you just need to follow your own policy. Okay, so let's move down from the scope.
There's more on this one.
Yeah. Okay, first category is security incident reporting. Now, in ISO and something similar in SOC 2, you need a mechanism for folks in your company to report an incident. ISO also wants them to report, weaknesses that they observe. So the concept here is, hey, security is everyone's job. Someone comes into your company and they're like, hey, I'm noticing that I don't need to use my MFA when I log into the CRM, or like they observe things. They're like, hey, my last company, this was like a lot more stringent, this control, or whatever it might be. You're empowering them and you're inviting them to report to your security team, hey, it seems like we're not doing a good job on these security areas, or I have concerns here, or like, what about this? And you're giving them a mechanism to report that. Now, incidents is also something that is suspected. So if it's like a phishing attempt or a weird text, all those sorts of things, you want a way for them to communicate them to your security team. Sometimes folks get more granular, like at Vanta, for example, we have a specific alias for phishing that we might also put out there. But if you want to just have one thing, keep it simple, just a mechanism to report suspected incidents, anomalies, weaknesses. You want to communicate that to your users. Okay, I talked on that way too long. Moving on, Kaylin, any questions there or comments?
I don't think so. I think for me specifically is like, as customers go through this, what can or can they not like manipulate in wording and things to like meet what they're doing today?
You can manipulate all the words and the wording stylistically. And, to your excellent question, Caitlin, here's a principle. The policy needs to be deadly accurate, exactly accurate to your organization. Do not leave something in the policy, which is, aspirational, like, hey, we kind of want to do that. Or Vanta had this in the template, so I think I need to leave it in. No, don't do that. Make the policy accurate for your organization.
Yeah.
If it means you have a weaker policy with less words, that's better than having a policy that you don't actually follow.
Perfect. I think that probably goes for majority of our policies, but Matt, obviously, as we go through this series, we'll call out when those things are not
right.
Common.
Yeah. So that being said, I don't think you should have no mechanism for people to report suspected incidents. You need something there, right? Like, hopefully that's intuitive to folks, but like, I wouldn't delete that totally. You can change it, you can tweak it, you can do it how you want, but some kind of mechanism that employees can say, hey, bad thing is happening. I think security team, like, please help me.
And I think too, like, as you go through things like this policy stack is, well, maybe we should start doing this, but if you're going to leave it in here, actually start doing it. It's not an aspirational thing.
Exactly. Yes, that's totally right. If you're in the early days of your journey, you can use this policy to help guide, like, what sort of controls should I be putting in? That's a perfect segue to number one, the second number one. Okay. Which should be number two, but whistleblower, anonymous fraud reporting. Please don't scroll past it. It's at the very top.
Yeah.
This is the thing you're probably not doing, right? Like, a lot of companies aren't going to just do this, especially if you're small. This is a SOC 2 thing. Okay. So SOC 2 asks you to have an anonymous channel. So this is important for like fraud reporting. It's important, if your boss is a major jerk and you can't trust them to report something, or you're just not comfortable, you feel you're going to be targeted, or there's going to be some sort of some sort of negative impact if you point out something that's bad, maybe it reflects on somebody, whatever it might be. So you have an anonymous reporting channel called a whistleblower policy, right? Now, how do you do that? Well, it's a commodity service, so you can go buy a third-party service to do that for you, publish their 800 number, etc. Or you can do something very simple. At Vanta, we built an anonymous web form. We link through it to the policy, and then when you submit that, it's submitted anonymously. It anonymizes your email address, and then it goes to some senior leaders, both like in legal and compliance, and then they can like track, or sorry, legal and HR actually, and then they can track that down. So I don't know if I need to say anything more about that. You can see we put it like a link to the anonymous reporting form. That's like one of the cheaper ways to do it if you don't want to use a service. So
one of the ones that somebody could remove if they wanted to.
ISO only, you can totally kill this, and you do not need it. It is not needed for ISO. It's explicitly called out in SOC 2. So I would try to put something in place for SOC 2.
Great. Are there any others in here that are not required for ISO?
Let's see as we go through it, right? So getting to the next number one, clear screen and clear desk policy. What is that first off? So clear screen and clear desk is basically you're not leaving a bunch of sensitive stuff and everyone's social security number and credit card number on your desk when you go to lunch and when you go home at night. And or same thing, you're not logged into everyone's medical records and then just leaving those on your screen at Starbucks, when you go get another latte. You are being mindful and you're putting things away from your desk, locking them up and or locking your screen when you're not using it, right? That's clear screen, clear desk. This is straight out of ISO. This is an ISO control. It is not explicitly in SOC 2. It's just a best practice. Okay, so if you don't want to do that, that's fine. But it's kind of a basic idea, right? Like, why wouldn't you just tell people, hey, don't leave sensitive stuff showing on your screen or showing on your desk, right? This is another thing where how's the auditor going to test this? This is going to be primarily probably if you're in a remote environment, it's going to be often kind of just tested on the policy because you don't have anyone's you don't have an office to walk through, right? Where everyone has their desk there. So if everyone's remote, one, it's maybe less important because like if you're at home, there's less people to see stuff. But just as a control, as a principle, raising awareness for users to think about how should they manage information. It's a good idea. It's a good best practice control. Okay, moving on. Caitlin, any questions? Any I missed on that?
Nope, pretty clear.
Yep.
Remote access policy is up next.
Okay. Yeah, remote access policy. So the concept here is you have some sort of security requirements around people accessing things remotely. I would say in a cloud first world, in a SaaS company world, especially if your workforce is remote, this is a control that you should have, both for compliance, but also just for security. The other thing that you can think about here is in a remote world, you often don't have good physical security control over the device and the endpoint and where the person's working. They could be working at a coffee shop. They're working from their home and you don't have any control over the security at their home or who the heck knows where they're working from, right? So by focusing on the endpoint and that remote access, you can de-emphasize those physical controls on in that environment and kind of move them into the machine and the data layer to still have security over the data at the end of the day. And so that's part of what the remote access policy is doing, and it's setting some basic rules for folks to follow. Good, moving on.
Yep.
Acceptable use policy. This is another best practice. It's also just a good idea to do it. This is where you have a more like explicit list of, things that you can and can't do. Typically has more to do with like the machines themselves or, something that's a little bit more like tactical. And this is great because you probably actually have things you do or don't want your users to do. So this is where you might talk about things like personal use of devices, of company devices, right? That's a hard one because you don't want your employees just doing personal business on their machine, but at the same time, be reasonable. They're using a work machine. Everyone's going to check their email or something anyway if you're not blocking that, if you're not in that high security of an environment. So you want to set a rule, that's fair. Now let me give you one more concept here. Having overly stringent and rules that aren't enforced is a bad security posture because it makes employees think like, oh, these are just silly, ridiculous rules. Oh, no one's enforcing them anyway because they're so ridiculous. Oh, well, how do I now determine what is actually a good rule that's meaningful versus these silly rules that no one follows and no one enforces? So it's better to have less rules or more, less stringent rules that you can actually enforce and live with. This is where you need to step back and think about, your actual environment And it's a balancing act. Good.
Yep.
Okay. Unacceptable use. These are the bad things. What should you not do? Don't use pirated software. Okay, that's bad. Don't, send, like chain letters and things like that, right? It's kind of like basic, hopefully, intuitive stuff. But at the same time, you can't assume everyone has your experience. Maybe you have some, newer employees that don't have a lot of experience, and you need to set the tone here for what you expect.
And this list could also be manipulated and changed, right?
Completely. There really is not in these frameworks. You're setting the rules. I believe, I can double check here that there's explicitly an acceptable use. ISO A5.10 rules for the acceptable use and procedures for handling information or other associated assets should be identified, documented, and implemented. So it says set rules. It doesn't say what the rules need to be.
Mm-hmm.
That's on you.
Great. Okay. Passwords and emails.
Yeah, email and communication activities. We have this called out actually for security. So this is like not a hard compliance section. It's just email is a super important tool and a vector for attack. If you read the annual, breach reports, phishing is like part of 80% of attacks and has been for years and years and years and will continue to be. It's just an extremely dangerous space. It's a good way for hackers to get in, is to trick users into giving too much information, clicking on a thing, downloading malware onto the device, etc. And so you, for security, should have some control around your email, and you should be thinking about phishing. Everyone should be thinking about phishing and how you're stopping that or controlling that for security. Good, folks?
Yep. I like the call out here to pyramid scheme. So no Mary Kay emails being forwarded around.
Not at work. Not at work, folks.
All right. Password policy.
All right. This is another a thing that you need to have. So both for compliance and for security. Okay, I don't see like an explicit call, but anyway, this is part of access control. And the idea here is, if you have like 3 character passwords, let's say, I know that'd be silly, that would be very hackable. And so that's bad security, right? So setting a minimum password policy at the corporate level that then every system will adhere to, is a very important control. Now, here's where I want to caution you. You need to set a minimum standard in your policy, and you can go over and above it in individual instances, but not the other way around, right? And so 8 characters is still like I believe NIST standard, like minimum. PCI for a long time was on 7. I think in 4.0 they jumped to 8. I'm not 100% sure on that. But if you want to then go set, 10 character password on your single sign-on or something, you're welcome to do that. But if you say 10 characters in your policy and then your single sign-on is 9, you're going to have an exception in your SOC 2.
Can you tell me about the password management system piece here? Is this something that like somebody has to have? Like we have 1Password and we use Okta for single sign-on. Like, is that something that like is necessary, or are there things built like within Mac that will handle that?
Yes. A password manager, a technical password manager per se, is not a compliance requirement. It's a best practice. And Vanta has always, from the beginning, strongly endorsed this as a best practice. And so that's carried through to like all of our work. And there are some other practical reasons. So passwords need to be well managed. And how do you do that practically if you don't have a password manager? And then there's another use case here, which is around, shared accounts. So shared accounts, I'm not going to get into it all right now, but it's a potential problem, and it's something you want to avoid as much as possible, because of this concept of non-repudiation. So if you have a shared account, if me and Caitlin both have the same account, and then a hacker gets that account and does something bad, well, who was that, right? Or one of us that's a malicious insider does something bad. You can't attribute it to a certain user. So that ability to attribute all of the behaviors and actions in a technical system to a specific user that they cannot deny is non-repudiation. It's really important control. But you'll find in engineering teams, there's things called like service accounts. There's a number of different use cases, administrative accounts, where it's just very challenging to have named users on everything. And so for business reasons, a business justification, a shared account is needed. And then password managers can help you to manage those shared passwords, a number of other things. So well, managing your passwords is required. Using a technical password manager is not. So if you're small, you're just not going to do it for whatever reason, that's fine. You can take it out of the policy.
Great. Okay. And then last but not least, these last few pages are just
this is us incorporating the rest of the policies in so that the users are aware, hey, this is my main thing, but oh, by the way, there's a lot of other requirements that I'm going to be responsible for. That's just like a nice to have that we added that we thought was helpful. If you don't like that for some reason, you could take that out.
Great.
Cool. We got through the whole policy. Awesome. Okay, wait, before we go, and things like glossed over, let's go to the bottom of the policy. What do we see after? Okay, keep going a little bit. There, stop here. All right. Two important sections here at the end that we need to cover. Exceptions and violations, okay? So exceptions. There are times when, for whatever weird edge case reason, you can't follow a policy. So a classic example is like background checks. Oh, you're like trying to hire someone in some European country where like a background check is illegal or like almost impossible, or it takes like, 2 years, whatever. You can grant exceptions to policies where you can say like, hey, we're not going to make Bob do a background check. It's your company. You have a right to do that, especially in ISO and SOC 2, where it's a risk-based scheme. But what you can't do is go to your SOC 2 audit and have your auditor say like, hey, I want to see the background check for these 5 people. And he's like, hey, Bob didn't have one. And you're like, oh yeah, we gave him an exception. And the auditor's going to say like, okay, let me see that. And then if you're like, well, we just said it was fine. No, that doesn't fly, right? Because you could say that for everything, right? Just to it would make it impossible to audit. So if you do an exception, you need to do it in a formal way, like on paper, that you can show you really did it and you're not just making that up right at the audit. And also, the person who's doing the exception needs some level of authority probably, right? So usually this rolls up into a fairly senior manager to do the exception, and you're going to articulate here in the policy who's able to do that exception. So, here we're rolling up to our head of operations as a senior leader, and we would track it on like a ticket. And so we'd have a dated ticketed system where we gave Bob an exception to his background check. And then when the auditor samples him, we're like, oh yeah, we gave him an exception. Here, look, May 23rd, 2023, Ari signed off, or my head of legal signed off on this guy's exception. Totally fine. Okay.
Is one use case for that, like contractors, for example, where you would see exceptions for contractors versus like true employees?
That could be fine. Now, I would tell you, if you're like giving every contractor an exception, that's a painful way to run your org. You should just change your policy and carve them out if you don't want them to do a certain control. So it'd be more like, hey, this one individual contractor can't do all the things, or they're only going to be here for a week and they're just working on our logo. Like, we don't want to make them jump through these hoops. So exception.
Got it.
But it should be an exception. You know what I mean? Like, it shouldn't be part of your normal flow, or just change your rules to accommodate that. Too much overhead, right? But yes. Good. Okay. Yep. And then the other one is violations. Okay, wait. So some of these control frameworks, they specifically say, hey, if someone's violating the security program, like there needs to be some sort of disciplinary process that is applied to them so that these things have teeth and have meaning. And so We set that up here in each policy. That's like, hey, if you violate this, like you're going to get in trouble and you might even get fired. So those are important parts of the policy. I would recommend not taking those out unless you have a strong point of view or business reason to do so, or and can also speak to the 2 use cases that I just outlaid for why they're there. Okay, then last piece, Galen, I know you're loving this, but the version control table at the bottom. This is old school version control. So these policies, they need like to be reviewed every year. That's part of the control. So you can show, hey, you did the review. And then it gets approved by a senior manager and you can show that there. And then you have like, it's a change management thing. The expectation here is you're not going to go change the policy unless you note it in the version control. So you know that it was approved by management and is, what they had approved, right? Vanta also has some change management workflow tooling built into the app. We are currently doing both. We do it, it's a belt and suspenders approach. So we do it in the tables because it's easy to show an auditor. And then we also use that functionality in the app. If you have a strong preference for doing like one or the other, you could do it that way, right? Like you could just do your true version control on the paper and then just have your admin like rubber stamp it in the app, or vice versa. You could make sure you do the workflow in the app and use Vanta to track it. Either way should work. Just try to be consistent in how you're applying the tool. That will make your life easier, when you go to audit.